Follow up.
Okay. Yeah. Good evening. Good evening. It is wonderful to see all of you and to welcome you to our event this evening. I'm Dana Cunningham, I'm the Dean of the Tisch College of Civic Life. It's my privilege to welcome you. Tonight we have historian, professor, writer, Tufts alum, Jumbo, Jill Lepore, here for our Solomont Speaker Series event. Tonight, we continue a series at Tisch College, a series of events and conversations throughout 2026 that will explore urgent and vital questions about what is next for American democracy. We're considering this theme in the context of the commemoration this summer of the Declaration of Independence. Together, we are asking questions like, what is the state of our democracy? How far have we come? Where are we headed? And what threats, concerns, questions, and opportunities must we confront? So I hope we will have a robust conversation about those topics tonight. We are fortunate to have two experts to lead us through the conversation this evening. Professor Lepore and our moderator, Professor Paul Polgar from the Tufts History Department. Let me just give you a quick introduction to both of them. And let me say that tonight we have some special circumstances. This is going to be the most timely Tisch event that has ever happened. We are ending exactly at 6:15.
Yeah.
Exactly at 6:15. So if our guests rush out of the room at 6:15, you will understand they have another engagement. So, but it's just to tell you, we've got to be timely tonight. Professor Jill Lepore is a professor at Harvard Law School and the David Woods Kemper class of 41, professor of American history at Harvard University, where she teaches classes in evidence, historical methods, humanistic inquiry, and American history. An award-winning writer, Professor Lepore is the author of many best-selling books and a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. And of course, Professor Lepore is a proud Tufts Jumbo, having received her undergraduate degree from Tufts, as well as an honorary degree from the university in 2014. Tonight, we're here to discuss her most recent book, We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution, which shares the messy history of the U.S. Constitution while also seeking to rekindle a sense of constitutional possibility, a perfect theme for tonight. Joining Professor Lepore in conversation is lecturer in the Tufts History Department, Professor Paul Polgar. Professor Polgar is a historian of slavery, race, and emancipation in the United States. He has published widely on race, citizenship, and anti-racist activism, including African-American disfranchisement in early national New York and Black Boston's protests against the film, The Birth of a Nation. His first book, Standard Bearers of Equality, America's First Abolition Movement, was a finalist for the Harriet Tubman Prize. Before I turn things over to our speakers, let me ask all the students in the audience to listen generously. Everybody's a student, right?
Yeah.
We are all students, lifelong learners. And to think about your questions, because tonight's event will also include a short audience Q&A. Short audience Q&A. And with that, let's welcome Professor Lepore and Professor Polgar.
Okay. Hi, Jill.
Hey,
Welcome back to Tufts.
thank you.
It's great to have you here for, I think, a very timely conversation about a very important book. So let's get right to it. As Dean Cunningham noted, 2026 marked the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. and also more broadly of American constitutionalism, state constitutions, which you rightly emphasize in your book as early as January of 1776. So how do you see your book speaking to this moment in light of this anniversary?
Yeah, I'm not the most planful person, but I did plan for the book to come out this past fall, trying to jump the queue of the onslaught of 250th books, because I was a bit concerned that, in fact, the origins of American constitutionalism would be lost in the highly politicized and culture war vibing commemoration moment, which also really focuses on the Declaration of Independence, which of course immensely important. But I just sort of wanted to I was hoping to inject constitutionalism into that conversation. And we are also, I guess this is another way of speaking to the moment. We're in a moment, and this has ebbed and flowed over the course of American history, where the Supreme Court has a great deal of power. And that always surprises me as a historian, not so much that it has that power, but that people don't think about what other forms of power there are with regard to constitutional interpretations. So the book I wanted to write was one that revealed the long history and tradition of popular sovereignty over the Constitution.
Yeah, great. So let's get into the book, right? Because so much of this, and you have the immortal words of Bugs Bunny here early on, right? The importance of amendment, right? But of course, the Constitution hasn't been substantively amended, right, since 1971, the 26th Amendment that lowers the voting age to 18. It hasn't been amended at all since 1992. So to begin unpacking why that is, can you give us a brief overview of the amendment process, right? What makes it difficult and what it takes to pass an amendment?
Yeah, so here's a brief civics lesson. Amending the U.S. Constitution requires a double supermajority. An amendment has to pass by a 2/3 supermajority in both houses of Congress. If that happens, it goes to the states, and then it has to pass by 3/4 of the states. Antonin Scalia once calculated that with the present demographics, this was maybe 30 years ago, 2% of the people can defeat a constitutional amendment. It's very, very difficult, and for most moments in American history, it has been effectively impossible to amend the U.S. Constitution. We have one of the lowest amendment rates in the world. So the Massachusetts Constitution, which was ratified in 1780, has been amended, I think, 123 times. It's very common. Most states have replaced their constitution. Massachusetts is unusual in that regard. So most nation states' constitutions last an average of 18 years. So our constitution, as the federal constitution, is very long-lived. And it's very little amended, and it's very difficult to amend. And these are distinguishing features of it. And many people would say that's why it's great, right? It was so good that it has required very little adjusting. That's a common argument that you find across American history. But the pattern that I'm tracing in the book is that because it is so difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution, which was not intended, hence the reference to Bugs Bunny, who sings this song called An Ode to the Amendments, where it's a vaudeville song, and he says, "It was intended to be amended." So you can find that on YouTube. It's the epigraph to the book. Yes. Everybody asks me about Bugs Bunny. So the pattern that I'm trying to illustrate in the book is that there are these bursts of amendment activity, like the Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments are passed all at once. The Civil War and Reconstruction amendments, 3 of them, 13, 14, 15, are passed within the space of 5 years. The Progressive Era amendments from 1913 to 1920, 4 amendments in 7 years. There are 4 amendments passed between 1961 and 1971. But between these bursts, there's no amending, but there's a lot of constitutional change. When the people sort of lose the ability to amend the Constitution, the Supreme Court steps in and amends the Constitution by judicial interpretation. And that happens until people get pissed off about it and they start ranting about judicial supremacy. And then people kind of regain the power to amend the Constitution. That's sort of been the pattern across American history. I don't actually think that we're in that pattern anymore. I think that pattern has come to an end. But one of the things the book is trying to do is say, I think when Americans think about the Constitution and they think it has a history, they just kind of picture the like calligraphic "We the People." And it's like an icon, not really a history. It's a motto, not a history. And if you think maybe if you have maybe once took a civics class or you took a legal history class, you might think of the history of the Constitution in terms of like a series of important Supreme Court decisions. Oh, well, there was Marbury versus Madison, then there was Dred Scott, then there was Plessy v. Ferguson, then there was Lochner, then then we get to Brown v. Board, then Roe, like, and that's the history of the Constitution. My book is like, no, that is part of the history of the Constitution, but actually all the things that people have wanted and tried to do all along is also the history of the Constitution, and it's sort of largely invisible to us.
Yeah, and I think that's a great bridge to what I was going to ask you next, because I think, one of the great virtues of this book is the way it sort of peoples the U.S. Constitution. And of course that builds in large part, right, on the amendments project, right, where you and your students documented really thousands of attempts to amend the Constitution over, the long durée of American history. So what does that history, right, of efforts to attempt to, reshape the U.S. Constitution, what does it suggest about popular sovereignty and involvement, and how have those efforts sort of informed we the people, right, and sort of what we the people has meant in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I remember, so I started this data project called the Amendments Project. It's free, it's online, it's a collection of every significant attempt to amend the U.S. Constitution. I did it with some students as a project. It was funded by the now defunct NEH, because I just felt like people should know how many times people have tried and failed to amend the Constitution. Not because these attempts are good ideas, like a lot of those thousands of ideas I think are terrible ideas, but I came across a guy in like 1896 who had done this for the first time, the first person to try to compile this list. And he said, I looked at it and I decided turns out if you look at this list, it's a pretty good index of the popular will. Like if you want to know what have Americans wanted constitutionally, making a list of all the things they ever tried to do by way of amendment is a pretty interesting list. Especially if you do, I think, what I tried to do, which was not just to look at what proposals get introduced on the floor of Congress, because there are like 12,000 of those. But, before women got the right to vote in 1920, before the Voting Rights Act in 1965, certainly before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the way many people living in the United States were completely unable to participate in politics. That would include Native nations. They participate in their own politics, but they had little voice congressionally, say, even though they were promised congressional delegates before the Constitutional Convention. So what I tried to do was look at, I think most Americans don't know that there were like 200 constitutional conventions held by Black men in the 19th century. I mean, we could think of them as extra constitutional conventions, but free Black men in the North met regularly in these regional and state and national conventions to deliberate what to do about the Constitution, while the states were having their own constitutional conventions that only white men could go to, and women held constitutional conventions, and Native nations held constitutional conventions. And if you look at all of that aspiring as well and think of those meetings as constitutional aspirations, then you really can kind of, as carefully as possible, come up with an approximation of a history of the American popular will.
So before I ask the next question, I actually want to turn to a brief passage from the opening of your book that I think gets at something really central in your framework in a very powerful and evocative way. So I'm just going to read that briefly before asking the question. We the people, the Constitution of the United States is made of things that are born, live, thrive, decay, and die. Insects, animals, plants, ideas. And then you juxtapose these key phrases from the U.S. Constitution with these sentences. In order to form a more perfect union, each of its elements began long ago in the loamy earth, hatching and creeping or slipping, slick and squealing from the womb of the mind. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. The text is written on parchment made from sheep, fleeced, their hides soaked in lime, stretched and dried. Provide for the common defense. The ink came from the buds of oak leaves, swollen to the size of musket balls by the eggs of wasps. Promote the general welfare. Its words were shaped by quills, fashioned from the feathers of molting geese. Secure the blessings of liberty. It's lofty, momentous ideas came from the minds of men long since dead and from the books they read. Now, other than just an excuse for me to read your beautiful writing, in that passage, you really bring the Constitution into a more material human register, I would say. So how should seeing the Constitution in those terms inform how we think about what the document is and how it operates, or maybe I should say how it should operate or ought to operate in American life?
Yeah, I thought a lot about that's the beginning of the book. And one of the things that always perplexes me as a historian, and I'm sure you have this in the classroom as well, is that people who don't study history, like the Constitution is this old piece of parchment, and it has a kind of scriptural quality to it. It has an iconographic quality to it. You can picture it. I think it's a little bit hard to hold it close. But if you're an 18th century historian, like you and I are, you're reading documents that look like that all day long.
Yeah.
Like it's just another document. Now, not to say it's like not really important. It is our frame of government, but it is also just another document. And you're like, well, how did it, like any other document? Who wrote it? When did they write it down? Why was it printed? Who read it? Who helped draft it? Was it revised? Like the process that you would ask of any other historical document. And for me, the materiality of documents is always really, really important. But I was also gesturing there, obviously, it's a paragraph that does a lot of work. Like one thing is the big debate among constitutional scholars is, between originalists who ask that we interpret the Constitution with reference only to its original meaning and understanding, and who have a somewhat worshipful notion of the Constitution, and between so-called living constitutionalists who treat the document as a living constitution that's constantly evolving. They have a kind of Darwinian notion of the Constitution. So I'm poking fun at both sides in a way there, both at the worship of it and at the kind of gross materiality. But I'll just say one funny story. That expression, womb of the mind, my editor was like, can we please get rid of that? I do not want to think about a womb in the first sentence of a book about the Constitution.
No.
And I was like, yes, you do.
Yes, you do.
That is part of
It's
my
the
point.
Constitution.
Yeah, it's part of my point. Like, it is okay. You have to picture a uterus right there, and you're gonna have to live with that. Yeah, so it's very purposeful, is I guess my point.
Birth of the nation, right? Yeah, and I think that's a good pivot too, and you've just named this, because I hear what you're saying, where you're sort of, poking at both sides, but of course, at this moment in time, our moment in the American experience, right? Originalism is pretty dominant for American jurisprudence, right? So your book does challenge the idea, right, that there is this single original meaning of the U.S. Constitution, right? And really points instead to this kind of long history of competing interpretations of the sort of many, multi-modal sort of efforts to reshape it. So how do you understand originalism in its current form? And where do you see its limits when sort of set against the history that you trace in the book?
Yeah, I think the book could be read as an intellectual history of originalism, among other things, because it is also a long examination of how the Constitution has been interpreted and by whom. And there are plenty of Supreme Court decisions and cultural postures that are akin to what we would now describe as originalism. Originalism, the term itself dates to 1980. And it becomes prominent in 1987 when Robert Bork is nominated to the Supreme Court and defeated. He was a nominee of Ronald Reagan. 1987 was also the 200th anniversary of the Constitutional Convention, so it was a moment of real veneration. Originalism really dates to the Reagan Justice Department. And it prevails on the court in terms of the ideological preferences of the majority of the justices, although I actually think originalism is effectively dead. So we could quibble about that. But in any event, the book traces many different origins of what becomes originalism and many different kinds of constitutional interpretation that compete with a deference to the ideas of the founding. And it makes a series of arguments. One is that originalism is not original. It's in fact counter-original. The framers of the Constitution have been, they're very explicit, this is not how they wanted the Constitution to be interpreted. And it also makes the case that originalism is not historical. I mean, it's a political movement above all. It is a method of constitutional interpretation that can be defended or, defeated. But it doesn't have anything really to do with history.
Yeah, and I take that point that, right, this book could be a history of originalism, and it's nebulous and shifting. But I think what we can all agree on, as we talked about at the opening here, is that amendment has stalled, right? And yet, of course, change doesn't stop, right? It just moves elsewhere. And so, as we know, right, a great deal of constitutional change today is happening through the courts and, of course, through executive power, right, rather than through amendments. So how do you understand the movement of constitutional change into the courts and the executive, and sort of the consequences of that sort of overlaid on your narrative?
Yeah. Well, let's get to the executive in a minute, but think first about the people versus the courts. Sure. And I think it is worth just emphasizing that there's not a lot of principle to be found in the history of American politics. So conservatives like the court when the court is conservative, and liberals like the court when the court is liberal, and then vice versa, right? So our modern era of constitutional amendment drought, is really a product of progressivism, right, and not of conservatism. So in the 1930s, when FDR, wanted to constitutionalize the New Deal, and the Supreme Court kept striking down elements of the New Deal, a lot of his advisors said, Frank, let's go ahead and get some constitutional amendments passed. Like, we just do like 4 or 5. We got to get this thing in there. Like, it's got to be solid. And he was like, we won't be able to get over the millionaires lobby. Like, there's so much lobbying. There had been so much lobbying to defeat the last amendment that was on the table from the progressive, which was the Child Labor Amendment. It passed Congress the day it was introduced in 1924, and it was stalled in the states by Southern mill owners. And he was like, we're never, it's a depression. We have to get this done. And he just kind of bullied the New Deal through the court, as we know, with the court packing plan. And civil rights activists also were like, we can't go for a constitutional amendment. We can't even vote. Like, how are we going to, we have to go to the courts. So the middle decades of the 20th century, liberals and civil rights activists all sought constitutional change through the court, principally through the Warren Court, beginning in 1953 and all the way to 1969. And conservatives came to power on the court by arguing against an active court, and said the only way to change the Constitution is by amending it, and the court should not be able to do that. But then once they saw that they were about to get power on the court, and they couldn't get any amendments passed because they didn't have anything like the popular majorities, super majorities required, then they came up with a different argument about how to make constitutional change, which was to restore the Constitution to its original meaning, which was to grant basically a new power to the Supreme Court to amend the Constitution, but under the guise of pretending that they were not changing the Constitution, but in fact restoring the Constitution. And so now you begin to hear progressives say, what about amendment? Maybe that's something we should think about. Like Gavin Newsom talks about amending the Constitution all the time now, because there's no way to get anything through the court. But your question is about executive authority, because what we're living in now, since January of 2025, is really, yes, the court has a role, but largely the president just is like, if I do it, it's constitutional, is his view. And he hasn't really been defeated in the making of that argument. But you couldn't get there without abandoning the power of the people and yielding it to the Supreme Court in the first place.
Yeah, and so for the sake of time, maybe I could try to meld 2 questions here before handing it off to Q&A, because I want to make sure we have some time for that. I'd love to unpack more of this history. I know we don't have a lot of time to do that. You've done a little bit of that, really importantly with the New Deal. So, you've mentioned some moments, right, in time, right, and movements like, the Civil War era, Reconstruction era, Progressive era, right, where you really have transformational constitutional change. Of course, it helps when you have, all Southern Democrats out of Congress, right, after the Civil War. But if you take that, right, and you take other moments, like, are there any patterns that you can sort of identify that helps explain how these transformative moments happen with
Yeah,
amending the
yeah. It
Constitution?
usually involves a war.
Okay.
So the Revolutionary War, that it's a war that there's a constitutional settlement somehow, which
Okay.
is, the Civil War. My argument doesn't work so well with the progressive era, but you could say the Vietnam War era works for that. So it's just that there needs to be something significantly disruptive of the existing political settlement that requires a new constitutional settlement.
Okay, good. So then pivoting to today, right? And not to sound too ominous, right? But then what would it take today to re-energize the possibility, right? And I think part of it could be also, as you said, and I totally relate to this even in the classroom, right? Sort of, shaking ourselves from this idea of looking at the Constitution as kind of like staid scripture, right? And instead see it as this, human construction of time and place.
Mhm.
But, are there any, current efforts or ways in which you can imagine sort of amending the Constitution, sort of gaining sort of feasibility?
Yeah, so I don't know about that. I have an article in the New Yorker last week about whether AI needs constitutions, some sort of response to Claude's constitution. I actually think that AI might put enough pressure on our set of political arrangements that we are willing to submit to a constitutional convention to figure out a way to move forward as a political community.
Something that could gain steam on both
Yeah,
sides of the aisle.
there's quite
Yeah.
a lot going on internationally with regard to involve in kind of democratic input in the regulation of artificial intelligence. It's a kind of in the way that the framers of the Constitution, like Alexander Hamilton, would have used the kind of Silicon Valley language of where it's a new era for humanity. We have founded the United States.
Right.
We're in that same kind of moment.
Yeah, great.
Not a war, at least not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Well, good. Well, I want to get to Q&A, so we could talk for a lot longer, but I'm going to leave it there. So thank you so much, Jill. Let's now open it up to the floor for questions. So I'd ask you to please raise a hand. The event staff will try to get to you as soon as they can. Very briefly introduce yourselves, and please make your question very brief because we only have about 15 minutes. So questions.
No,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, sorry, right here. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, no, we have come someone behind
Yep.
you. Sorry.
Yep.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Will Mba. I'm the Vice President of the Somerville City Council, originally from Cameroon. I'm also running for state representative in this district. I guess I'm so inspired by your work and your book. And my question is, it's about storytelling and power. So who gets left out of this American story today? And how does that omission shape policy and power?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very succinct and pithily put, but it's a huge question. I think you can watch a lot of that happening in the 250th commemoration, right? Where I think that the really important work going on is at the local level, towns and neighborhoods, city neighborhoods, school districts, thinking about ways that they want to tell a story about their school, they want to tell a story about their town. I think that stuff is really powerful, but I think what's coming out from the federal government, and in some case, to some degree, even from some of the states, is just acts of political persuasion, as opposed to kind of an earnest inquiry into this moment in time and its history. So I think it's really important to celebrate the places where I think that work is done the best, which is in K-12 public classrooms, public school classrooms, where, I mean, if you've spent time recently in one of those classrooms and the kind of work teachers are doing, trying to have these conversations with children and very young adults, I think there's a tremendous amount of goodwill and fascination with, it is intellectually fascinating to be in a country that's undergoing such a mess, right? Like it is, like if it wasn't so painful, it would be intellectually just really interesting. So I think there's a lot that goes on in classrooms that's really exciting.
Great. Yes, right in the middle.
I can speak.
Yeah.
It's that nobody can hear you.
Right.
Hi, I'm a Tufts alum. I just wanted to make a comment about trying to amend the Constitution now. I just feel like we are so divided. I can't imagine this country coming together to have that kind of supermajority on any issue at all. I feel like people are saying, well, if you want abortion rights, live in Massachusetts. If you don't want abortion rights, live in Texas. You know, people are just making those kinds of choices. That's one comment. And then the other comment is, I loved your article in the New Yorker about the Chapman House.
Oh, thank you.
I went to Tufts and lived in the area in group houses, and almost everything you wrote about happened to me.
Yeah, I got a lot of emails from people like, I lived in almost that house. I do think we are that divided. And additionally, we have lost a set of democratic skills that are necessary to do the work of amending the Constitution. So I think there are 15 states that have mandated in their state constitutions that every 10 years, or maybe in some cases it's 15, the citizens have to be asked on a ballot, should we have a constitutional convention for the state? And since 1986, when Rhode Island held one, no state in the US has held a constitutional convention. And so people don't know how to do it. So as if like we hadn't done, if nobody had done jury service in like 30 years, well, we could start up again, but people would be like, I don't know, do I trust 12 strangers to decide anything? Like, we don't trust each other in that way anymore. We also don't have it written into our experiences. So it's not just constitutional conventions in the states, but it's the kind of daily deliberation that's part of, a much more face-to-face communal experience. I mean, that's why studying civic life is so important, and trying to cultivate these institutions of civic life that, that this program is trying to do are so important, because they have atrophied, right? So yeah, I think it would be really cool to have a federal constitutional convention, but not tomorrow. Like, everybody's still in bed under the covers. Like, you need to be training for that marathon for like a good year, and you maybe got to begin by getting out of bed. And you absolutely have to throw your effing phone out the window. Like, we absolutely can't do anything democratically without addressing social media.
That goes back to the AI, right? And getting
Yeah.
off of our phones and in our silos. Okay, yes. Just going in order, they'd seen a hand. Go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for being here. I'm Molly. I'm a senior here. And I just finished up reading your article about the Anthropic AI Constitution. My question is, for future generations, in your view, what will the impact of AI be? And essentially, is it going to bring about the end times?
That's your next book, right?
Yeah, I wrote a book this past summer in kind of a fugue state that's called The Rise and Fall of the Artificial State. That explains how we got to this point in living in what I call an artificial state, which has replaced the liberal democratic nation state in constitutional democracies, but also in which I predict that we will get out of this. So I'm not just trying to stump from my book, but I don't think the end times are actually coming, but I do think that, as that article, I tried to illustrate that the idea that multinational corporations are writing constitutions for things that could kill everything on the planet, and our government is doing nothing, is the nature of the problem. It's not the nature of a solution.
Great. Yeah, let's go to the front. We haven't been here. Yeah, right here. Yep. Go ahead.
No, wait for the mic. People really
Yes.
can't hear.
Right.
We can
Yes.
hear you, but.
Thank you. My name's Kathy. I'm a classmate and brought some other classmates, and we're so happy to be here. I have a question about campaign finance reform, because I see a lot of the current polarization as a direct result of the money in politics. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and if you see that changing at, anytime.
Yeah. So one of the more active efforts to amend the Constitution is the effort to overturn Citizens United. I think it's a fairly strong movement. I don't think it can defeat the forces that are arrayed against it. But I would point out that 14 of our 27 amendments overturn Supreme Court decisions. Like, that's largely what the amendment
Yep.
process is for. Right? Like,
That's right.
the only way to overturn Dred Scott was to, to wage a war and then amend the Constitution. So it's an important model, and I wish that people who are doing that work were thinking a little bit harder about how to get it done by looking at past amendment efforts, including the failed ones. Yeah, it does seem to be necessary, and I think there's actually more bipartisan support for it. If there are these things called sunrise amendments that people talk about sometime, which is like the amendment wouldn't go into effect until, say, 2060. This is one way to abolish the Electoral College, because most Americans hate the Electoral College. They just like it if, in the near term, if it advances their party. But if you could have an amendment that said, we'll abolish the Electoral College as of 2060, you could maybe get that thing through. Similarly with campaign finance, like it's just a crapshoot. You don't know whether it would advantage or disadvantage your political interests. But if you think it's for the good of the country and future generations, maybe you could do it. I think that's a path toward amending the Constitution.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, and then we'll come back here. Yeah.
Hi, welcome. My name is Sarah Mattis, and I am a graduate of the old environmental and policy program, which is now, I guess, a department. My question is, in light of all of this depressing stuff you've talked about, and in light of the times we're in the context of your view of the arc of history, and seeing which movements triggered positive outcomes, how would you translate that into today, and where you would see positive, other than K-8, where you would see potential positive outcomes from basic grassroots movements?
Yeah, I think I would look at local politics, and the more local, the better. I think that the nationalization of local politics has been terrible for communities. That's partly a function of the destruction of the newspaper, which was the willful act of social media companies. So I think we have to kind of rebuild civic life from the town and the neighborhood up. And that's where I honestly put most of my energy. That's where I would look for success.
Okay, I have to go all the way to the back, and then we'll come back here. Yes, all the way to the back here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Cindy. I'm an alumni of the philosophy department here. I was wondering, and this might just be asking for elaboration on your on the comment you just made, but do you have any thoughts about epistemic best practices that contribute to more effective civic engagement in light of the social media landscape nowadays? So what I'm thinking is that my understanding is that there's often a big gap between expert knowledge and what a ordinary citizen might know. And there's a lot of room for sort of pollution of the discourse somewhere in the kind of the communication between. And I was just wondering if you have any recommendations or advice for audience members or others to become more informed in a more reliable way without falling into, echo chambers.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I always feel like I have a kind of stupid, snappy answer, which is throw away your phone. But I do actually believe that you should throw away your phone. I really believe that. And I write a lot in this forthcoming book about exactly how social media companies have destroyed our ability to think clearly about most things, not just because the information is impoverished and it is asymmetrical, but because the clarity of our thought is worsened. So I really do believe that. That said, it's not that actionable for most people. So I don't mean to be glib about it. I think there are organizations to become affiliated with where there are local chapters that meet face to face, that there are all these, you've probably heard about these bridging organizations like Bridge USA, Braver Angels, that try to bring people of different political backgrounds together. It's almost like AA. It like really is. It's like, we're going to have a meeting tonight. There are going to be some Democrats there, and there are going to be some Republicans there, and there are going to be some never Trumpers and some Trump voters, and there's going to be some really far left progressives, and there's going to be some moderates. And I wrote an article for the New Yorker several years ago called "The Last Time Democracy Nearly Died." It was about the 1930s. And I outlined efforts that were made by different groups, including like public radio and commercial radio broadcasters, universities, public schools, adult education efforts, public libraries, to address the declining faith in democracy and Americans' growing polarization and appetite for fascism. And I hear from readers all the time, like, oh, I thought that was that thing you talked about, how they did in the 1930s. That was a good idea. We're trying to do that in my town now. So you might recommend thinking about some of the things that are in that article. It's a kind of an interesting to-do list. And it's also an interesting counterfactual where the cutting edge technology of communication, which was the radio, was really, really effective at defending democracy. Whereas, of course, in Germany, the radio was an incredibly powerful instrument of advancing Nazism. Everyone had to have a radio in their house. It was required. And Goebbels had a switch on his desk, and he put it on, and everybody had to listen to what he had to say. Like, Americans invented the radio reinvented the radio in the 30s in a different way. So I think it's actually an interesting counterpoint about the democratic possibility of communications technologies.
Okay, right here, and then I need to come there, and then I think we'll end that. So two more, so we got to be really succinct here.
Hi, my name is Sorsha. I'm a junior here at Tufts, and I think a lot about how American values are like kind of created, and the Constitution is obviously a big factor in that. But American values didn't start with the foundation of America as a country. And so I was wondering if you could speak to where kind of the idea of a Constitution and the values that were put into the Constitution really came from.
Yeah, the whole book is really about that. But in brief, these people thought, okay, we hate that England doesn't have a constitution, because when Parliament taxed them, they were like, it's unconstitutional. And Parliament was like, show us where it says that. So they're like committed to writing it down. So then when they committed to writing it down, they're like, what are we going to put in it? So they studied the great political philosophers of antiquity, mostly like Aristotle. And like, okay, these people are brilliant. They had great ideas: mixed government, power leads to tyranny. Here's what we need to have checks on power. But then they lived in the age of Isaac Newton and the idea of gravity. So they thought, like, okay, but if science is like follows natural law like gravity does, like the physical world, then we need to build a machine that can do the things that the philosophers of antiquity thought would be good, like mix the government and have checks and balances. And so that's what the Constitution they devised. It had to be written down. It had to have the wisdom of the ancients. It has to have Newtonian physics, and it's kind of like a watch. It works perfectly. And then because it was going to be written down and this was new, it had to be amendable by the people, or else the only way to deal with its problems in the future would be by revolution. And they had just come out of a terrible revolution, and they didn't want another one. And they knew that if it became unamendable, that it would produce an insurrectionary politics, that the only way to really change the government would be by insurrection. And that's the world we live in now. We have an unamendable constitution, and we are doomed to live in this world of insurrectionary politics.
Okay, last word. You've had your hand up for a really long time here, so really quick. Yeah, this gentleman right here. Yep.
So I'm Park Wilde. I teach in the nutrition school. Climate action organizations have long proposed a format that they call people's assemblies. And I would have thought it was too utopian to be interesting, except I so appreciated your nice comments about the 19th century efforts to have constitutional conventions that didn't actually have power as a way of modeling. Would you have any recommendations for such a people's assembly?
Yeah, so there's a scholar at Stanford, James Fishkin, who has written a lot about deliberative democracy. And he has this sort of specific to-do list for having such an assembly. You bring people together, you pay them, you have them for a weekend. Your first day, you have experts come in with different views and different expertise, and they present a lot of information. People absorb it, then they deliberate, then they have a poll. Like, he has a lot of evidence that this works. There are a lot of critics of this. The thing that I think the evidence suggests does not work at all is online engagement. Most, like Silicon Valley people are like, oh, deliberation. We'll send out, these crawled data collectors and we'll know what the people want. Like Anthropic just released this big project. We talked to 80,000 people about what they want in Claude. It's like, okay, that's consumer research. That's not democracy. So I just think anything that's going to be done digitally, and apologies to the digital political scientists in the room, has historically undermined our ability to live with one another. Thanks very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
I'm very
Thank
sorry
you,
that I
Jill.
have to run.
Thank you so much, Joe, for making it. And thank you all. Have a great night. Thank you, Joe.